I figured it out, but figured it out makes me sound like I'm smart, in that way. No, I figured it out. That is, no, just stick to it. Just keep at it. And the adage of the harder you work, the luckier you get is what happened, honestly. And so I ended up, tripping into reality TV at its inception because somebody took a chance on me, and it flourished from there. The poetry thing continued just because I'll write all of my life, regardless of whether I get paid to do it.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
We're all shopping for essentials online these days, and now you can get rewarded for it. With the Bank of America Cash Rewards credit card, you can choose to earn 3% cash back on online shopping essentials. The essentials have never felt more rewarding. Visit bankofamerica.com/more rewarding to apply now. Copyright 2020 Bank of America Corporation.
So you've heard from so many of our podcast guests about how stress, sleep, and recovery impact your ability to perform at your best every day. About a month ago, I started using Newcom, and I'm always amazed by how refreshed I feel after a 20-minute session with Newcom. I'm not only re-energized, but able to focus more and do more creative work. I've used it after a really bad night of sleep or on those days when I just can't get into the zone. It's like a 20-minute power nap. The Newcom system uses cutting-edge neuroscience and consists of 3 non-invasive and non-pharmaceutical items, all of which are included in your monthly subscription that actually costs less than a daily cup of coffee. The whole process is easy to use and to work into your daily routine to achieve better sleep, reduce stress, and boost recovery. If you want to see some serious improvements in your performance, do what I did. Own the day with Newcom. We have a special link set up specifically for our listeners. Go to creativenewcom.com and get 50% off your 30-day subscription of Newcom and their money-back guarantee. That's creativenewcalm.com. Again, creativenewcalm.com. Donny, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, it is my pleasure to have you here. So as I was saying before we hit record, I found out about your work through Cher Hale, who is literally the only publicist that we have never once said no to. She has a remarkable track record with us. Anytime my friends ask who should I hire as a book publicist, she's the person that I say they should go to. So absolute pleasure to get in here. Before we get into your work, I want to start asking you, what did your parents do for work? And how did that end up shaping the choices that you've made throughout your life and career?
My dad was a postal worker for 35 years after the Air Force, and my mom was a nurse's aide. So, working class family in Pittsburgh.
Uh-huh.
And in terms of how it shaped my upbringing, lots of ways. I mean, some of them invisible that I couldn't even tell you, I'm sure. But the ones that I'm super aware of have to do with work ethic, for one. My parents worked very hard and encouraged me to work hard and to be consistent and reliable. And also, I guess an offshoot of that was the notion of integrity and being honorable and being true to your word. And some of that certainly got reflected in the workplace, but they also wanted it to be reflected in how I treated other people, how I kind of showed up in the world, as a young Black kid in a world that wasn't necessarily built for a young Black kid. So those are some of the ways that I think what my parents did for a living and how they invested themselves in work and honor and integrity. I think those are things that informed who I am.
Yeah. So, I mean, with your dad as a postal worker, I mean, and your mother doing what she did, these seem like very consistent, predictable career paths that have a very, very linear arc. And of course, just from knowing what I do about you, I know yours hasn't been that. What did they teach you about making your way in the world? Like, what did they teach you about careers? What advice did they give you? And when you present a path like this to them, what do they say to it?
Well, that's interesting because they didn't present a path to me. What they did was nurture me being like a bright, shy kid, and so they certainly encouraged reading, and they were very supportive of my academic success. And because there was no kind of pathway beyond working class life, they really couldn't envision what I would be. I think part of it was just a great reservoir of hope that it would be something beyond what they were doing. And so it was just a constant diet of being boosted up. So basically, whatever you're doing, keep doing that, and keep bringing A's home. And why is there a B? And I bet you can do better. That kind of thing.
Sounds a lot like an Indian family.
Yeah, and but I guess what is implied in that is we know you can, as opposed to something lofty and unreachable. The unspoken assumption is that we know you can, and only in hindsight did I realize that was the thing. That level of confidence in my ability to do things was kind of a lifeblood, and definitely informed my willingness to take risks and try things that nobody else in my family had the opportunity to do or the interest in doing. So I think their support allowed me to be risky in a family where people did take stable jobs because risk wasn't a way to put food on the table.
Yeah. Well, so in addition to that, so, one of the things I thought was interesting that you said, for them, they didn't put a path in front of you because of the fact that they couldn't see, sort of beyond the working class life that they had. So as a young boy with, them as your parents, how did you find the vision for what your life could be when that's what they could see? But obviously you saw something else.
And I can't take credit for being, this amazing visionary, honestly. Part of it is just kind of tumbling through it. But what they did do is encourage education. And so, I basically lived in the hood, in Pittsburgh, in a neighborhood called Homewood that I cherish to this day. But the schools in Homewood at the time the public schools were not the best. And so they sent me to Catholic school, which was the equivalent of a prep school, even though we were Baptist and, certainly didn't practice Catholicism. But those were the best schools in the city, basically, in terms of preparing someone for, a life in education. And so what they were, I think, prescient about was being able to place me in a very educationally rich environment, so that whatever seed I had could flourish. So I think I thank them constantly for having the foresight to do something like that. And they didn't know how it was going to turn out, and of course neither did I. And as I just kind of propelled through that system, what that does is it provides options. It provides opportunities for one to risk, to try new things, to fail, and to learn from those failures. And so being in an academically rich environment allowed me to grow, to find my best smart self, if you will. And through that, I discovered things that I wouldn't have ordinarily discovered. Nobody in my family before me had graduated from college, for example. And so that was a path that seemed organic, seemed natural based on my academic success in high school. So the goal was, okay, I guess you go to college now. And didn't know what to major in, didn't know, what that was going to mean at the end of it. But in 11th grade, I took a psychology course because I was trying to avoid a hard science class, and that was an elective that I could take. And up to that point, I thought I was going to write for a living. I started writing when I was 8 and thought that was going to be, who I was. But I didn't have any idea how to make a living at writing, except, I had heard of journalism. That didn't seem to be quite it. But then the psychology class kind of exploded my thinking about what I could do. Because it tapped into what I, as a shy, bookish kid, was already doing, which was paying attention to people, trying to figure out how they tick. And for me, I was writing and trying to be creative in my exploration of that. But this was a whole discipline that was about trying to understand people. And it was this eureka moment. Hey, I'm going to do that. And so I majored in psychology, and off I went, to undergrad, having no idea what that adventure was going to be, but it was the beginning of a grand adventure, as it turned out.
Yeah. So I think that what's fascinating to me is you have the contrast of two environments, right? You mentioned you grew up in the hood, but then you went to what were the best public schools or the best schools in Pittsburgh at the time. And I have so many questions about this around race, around community, but let's start with the environment piece, because, I wonder, when you have an environment like the one that you grew up in, and then you go to school in an environment that's completely different, how is it that you managed not to succumb to the environment that you're in at home or in your neighborhood? And also, this is a question I asked one of our former guests who had happened to be a white guy who grew up in South Central LA, like in an all black neighborhood. When we look at this stuff, and I was asking him and I'm very curious from you, because as a black person, your perspective, I think, would be interesting, because, he was a white guy giving me his perspective. But, when I look at neighborhoods like that, like my perception of neighborhoods like that is, I probably guarantee you, completely inaccurate, because my entire perception of it is based on having seen John Singleton movies like Boys in the Hood. So when you look at how media portrays environments like that, what do you think that we misunderstand? And why is it that we get somebody like you who comes out of a neighborhood like that and accomplishes what you have and transcends the environment? And then on the flip side, you get people like the characters in Boys in the Hood, or the people who end up in prison.
I think it's easy to cherry pick, the high profile things. And if you have a media culture that, if it bleeds, it leads, et cetera, it's often going to pick the high profile but low incident events, because those are more sensational. Those are more interesting to get people to watch your program. And so what it does miss, it does miss the things that are mundane but beautiful at the same time. Loving families and intact households, and a camaraderie between people of the same cohort. So that's not interesting for the news, because the news traffics in exceptions. And so I think one of the things that we have to keep track of is the media is going to show you the things that differ from the mundane, because that's what makes sense for ratings. I think we should absolutely worry if what the news is doing is showing us just good things, because that means that's the exception to the horrible things that are happening in the news. So I think that's one of the things that the narrative about urban life misses, because of how we're built to learn things in terms of our media culture.
Yeah. Now, as far as, sort of transcending the environment, why is it that, like, what is it that happens to somebody who doesn't end up in your situation and life goes, kind of into disarray for them?
And, there's a novelist and writer from Pittsburgh, from Homewood, in fact, John Edgar Wideman, who, grew up in the same neighborhood that I did, and has a brother, and he ended up, as a writer, his brother ended up going to prison for life. And so under the same household and same neighborhood. And so it's ineffable what can happen, in a family because of how people are put together and how the environment reacts to how people are put together. So it's hard. It's sometimes hard to say. I mean, again, that's the same household and two different outcomes from siblings who, it's not like they were 20 years apart and, generationally different. And so that's a fascinating study, sadly so, for me, but it happens all the time. And I can certainly name people who grew up in the same neighborhood that I did, and, that I don't consider myself smarter than they were. and their lives didn't turn out, the way mine did. One of the things that I had that, that was the bedrock for me was, again, my parents' commitment to nurturing, this shy, bookish kid, and blocking for me and getting stuff out of my way. And so, growing up bilingual, bicultural in that sense. So, yes, I had to negotiate what was true about my neighborhood, and still, wear a necktie in school, for 12 years. And so that level of agility and versatility was a survival tool, and it served me well. Didn't know, and again, I don't want to place myself as this person who was so aware of how nimble I was becoming. It just happened. I grew up and survived it all, and so I can't take full credit for all the good things that were propping me up. But I think I've tried to be, to my other point about how I grew up, honorable, to what my parents fed me, So I tried not to waste those things, and tried to, take some of the risks that they couldn't.
Mm-hmm. So, we've had, as you might imagine, a lot of conversations about race this year. And so given where you grew up, I couldn't help but ask you about it because, you mentioned that, you grew up in a world that was not really, suited or not designed for a young Black boy to thrive. So what were race relations like at the time when you're growing up? And what did your parents teach you about race?
Yeah, that's I'm fascinated by it still as I look back, because I grew up in a time when things were kind of in transition, going from colored to Negro to Black to Afro-American. That was an interesting trajectory, and watching that happen as the neighborhood was also in transition and becoming more Black. Whereas before it was pretty diverse, and I would say it leaned more toward predominantly white. Watching that happen, so being someone who grew in his ethnic identity at the same time the neighborhood was growing in its identity was just a fascinating parallel as I look back on it, and so what my parents often talked about in those early discussions about race. We didn't have the talk that Black parents have to have, I think, with their children now about the danger of being Black with law enforcement. It was more about being respectful and being making sure that you were a good example of what Black people could be, because people's perception was so skewed in the opposite direction. The goal was for me to make sure that I wasn't feeding into those stereotypes. So be polite, be respectful, be honorable and have integrity, et cetera. Because the prevailing narrative, because people didn't spend a lot of time really interacting with each other, was stereotypical.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, Isabel Wilkerson wrote this brilliant book called Caste, which I had, alluded to in the previous conversation with Laura Robbins, who's a writer for Huffington Post, who was here. I had a fascinating conversation with her about this around stereotypes and where they come from. Stereotypes are fascinating to me because, I mean, the funny thing is, like, stereotypes, in a lot of ways, they get shaped by kind of our experiences. So we make broad generalizations based on individual experiences. So we turn, individual experience into universal truth when it comes to stereotypes. And I mean, even as an Indian person, I know that there are things that people have as stereotypes about us. But what I wonder about your life experience, like, what do you remember as one of your first experiences with racism?
And I appreciate the question, because it is important to kind of map out, what's the constellation of racism in any given person's life, because it will differ from time to time, and so yeah, Uh, I like talking about it just because it has been such a journey, you know. So you know, one of the earliest uh, recollections had to do again with the academic environment that I was in, and I wrote an essay, you know, as a part of a class assignment, and I was like in the second grade, and and you know they asked us to write some stuff, and I used the word ritual in my essay, and the teacher thought I had copied it from somewhere. She thought somebody else had done the work for me, because there's no way that I should know that word um, uh, as a second grader, and her countenance about it was, and at least my interpretation about it was, you little black boy couldn't possibly know that word yet, and use it correctly, you know, in a sentence, and so it became this inflamed thing where my parents had to come to the school and basically explain to them, look, this is a kid who's been reading, you know, since he was 3. He reads the dictionary for fun. Yes, he knows that word. He uses it regularly, and in addition to a whole bunch of other words that are certainly beyond what you would expect a second grader to use. And he is, if not equal to, perhaps superior to some of the other kids in this class. And we kind of insist that you recognize that and not accuse him of malfeasance. And so, and at the time there was no discussion. I mean, she didn't say, "You little black boy," this or that. But in the aftermath and the postmortem of it, my parents talked about it as a racial incident, and I hadn't made that connection at all, honestly. And I was one of maybe 2 black kids in the class of you know, maybe you know, a dozen. And so that was the first time I had to think about people's perceptions of me, including this element in a way that wasn't positive, that somehow detracted from who I was. And so it was a very complicated moment, but I do consider that kind of my first recollection of the awareness of race as a negatively valenced thing.
At Traditional Medicinals, we look to Mother Nature for all her healing gifts. We believe that plants can do some pretty amazing things. That's why we use medicinal-grade herbs like echinacea, eucalyptus, and ginger in our teas to help soothe and support your body naturally. Every which way we turn, Mother Nature is there to remind us that she's got our back. Visit traditionalmedicinals.com and use code WELL20 to see what makes our teas so incredible.
Stress, sleep, recovery. Whether we're in the gym or at work, these things really shape how we perform. I know that I need a good night's sleep to do my best creative work, but sometimes that just doesn't happen. And one of the things that I've added to my routine that's made a noticeable difference is NewCalm. I did my first 2 sessions recently, and I was amazed by how much it could re-energize you. It was like an afternoon power nap combined with a meditation that led to a lot greater focus throughout the day. It's imperative to your health and happiness to be able to manage stress and not be managed by it. NewCalm gives you the power and control to relax and recharge anywhere, anytime. NewCalm is the only stress management system of its kind, clinically proven in over 1 million sessions to improve your sleep, reduce your stress, and boost your recovery without drugs and side effects. The NewCalm system uses cutting-edge neuroscience and consists of 3 non-invasive and non-pharmaceutical items, all of which are included in your monthly subscription that costs less than a daily cup of coffee. The whole process is easy to use and to work into your daily routine to achieve better sleep, reduction in stress, and boost in recovery. Do what I did. Own the day with NewCalm. We have a special link set up specifically for our listeners. Go to creativenewcom.com and get 50% off your 30-day subscription of NewCalm and their money-back guarantee. That's creativenewcom.com, NUCALM, creativenewcom.com.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Finding Forrester with Sean Connery.
Sure.
But that almost exact scene plays out for the young kid, he ends up writing something because he's this incredibly talented basketball player, and he goes to some fancy prep school in New York, and he ends up writing something that's so brilliant that the teacher actually questions whether it's his. And then finally at the end, Sean Connery comes in and reads it. And he says, I had to come and read this for my friend Jamal because he wasn't allowed to read it, but these are his words, not mine. And it just reminds me of that.
Yeah. And, I've said there's been many incidences, that resemble that one where, the unfortunate compliment of somebody being surprised at how well you did something. And I resent that level of surprise, and I went through this. I've been through this in every, iteration of my academic life for sure. And in some cases, in my personal life, where people are talking about how articulate I am, and as if that's a surprise.
Right.
And obviously, Chris Rock has joked about it with talking about Colin Powell in terms of like what were you expecting?
Yeah. Well, it's like when my parents, somebody tells my parents, "Oh, it's like your English is so good." It's like, well, we've been here for 25 fucking years. Of course, our English is decent. And it's funny you mentioned this because my dad is a college professor, and you're in academics, so you know how the system goes of like tenure and then promotion after promotion. And I've had to literally rewrite rebuttal letters for him because he's been denied promotions that were like completely not factual. I looked at them and he's like, yeah, none of this is true. And I was like, well, then why is this happening? You've been at the university for 25 years. And it was shocking to me that, in an environment like a university, he actually said, he's like, in all honesty, he said it's partially racism. And I could not believe that, after this long, and he's been there for almost 30 years at this point. So what I wondered now is, having grown up the way you did in the neighborhood that you did around the time that you did, when you look at where we're at now, and part of the reason, I wanted to talk about this in particular is because as I was reading the poems, I noticed that a lot of your poems centered around specific events, which we'll talk a bit about. But when you see where we're at now, and you see where how you grew up, like, how do you feel? Hopefully with the election of Biden, we're going to get out of this mess. But I did see somebody say it was actually a woman on Trevor Noah. I think she was a sociologist of some sort, a black woman, and he was talking to her about some of this and two-party systems. She said, you still have to remember 70 million people voted for Trump, and many of them, she said it doesn't change the fact that we live in a divisive society just because we have a new president.
It's chilling, the number of people who voted for him, and the fact that we're verging on 2021, and that's still a thing. It's stunning, and as much as there is to celebrate, there's at least 70 million other things to be fearful of, and even though I'm. I've been fortunate and I've worked hard, and so I've managed to get some of the prizes. I have doctor in front of my name if I really want to insist on that. I have a couple of Emmy awards, so that's the biggest prize you can get in the profession that I'm in, and I'm still alive, and so. But even though those things are true, nobody pulling me over at a stoplight is going to see any of those things. They're just going to see a black dude in a car. And so I have to go through all of the algebra of what can this turn out to be, because I don't have time to list my CV for this cop.
Right.
And I have no idea what all of his history has led to in terms of how he perceives me as a 200-pound muscular black guy in a car. Yeah. And so that's a different narrative, especially when you look at the what can be perceived as a dysmorphia in terms of law enforcement often misperceiving what a 12-year-old looks like in a Tamir Rice or a Mike Brown who looks like a monster, or Terrence Crutcher, who was perceived from a helicopter as being dangerous. Like, I have to be concerned about what the lens is that I'm being perceived by, even in 2020, even after 70 plus million people vote for the guy that I wanted them to vote for. But then there's, and again, if you look at the 70 million people, that represents the people who voted. That doesn't represent the people who are related to them, who are living next door to them, who didn't vote, who still believe the same thing. So it's at least 70 million people. And so having to negotiate that every day. And I wrote an essay about this. I posted on the Facebook several years ago called "What I Want White People to Know About Me." And so one of the things that I talked about in the essay was you have very little idea of the weight that I carry into a situation. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I'm privileged in comparison. And so if I have to worry about these things and I have a certain amount of privilege that can protect me, if I insist on people calling me doctor, things change, fairly quickly in those situations where it's like, oh, okay, so this is not quite what I thought it was going to be, But not everybody has that weapon, if you will, to wield in a situation that is electrified by race.
Well, it's funny. I'm sure you've probably seen it. Dave Chappelle, in one of his stand-up comedy bits, tells this story about how he and a friend were walking around and they were both stoned. And, they walked up to the police officer he's like, we're not going to ask for a cop for directions, because he talks about how black people are afraid of the police. And he goes, a black man would never talk to a policeman while he's high. That would be a waste of weed, which, I remember hearing that. But then, and he tells the story about how his white friend goes to the cop and he's like, hey, we're kind of stoned. And the officer's like, calm down. And he's like, 8th Street is that way. And then just lets them go. But the funny thing is, this isn't just an American thing. Like you kind of triggered a memory for me that my dad told me about. So my dad was a PhD student in Australia growing up. And at that time in the late 70s, Australia was very open to immigration. And a lot of Indians ended up going there. And he had another postdoctoral candidate who was in his lab with him, who was a black person. And he told me, he said, when we would go to look at apartments, people wouldn't rent to the guy simply because he was black. Mm-hmm. And my dad finally got to the point where he had to literally call in advance and say, listen, I have a friend who's looking for an apartment. I'm going to bring him there to look at it, but we don't want to waste the gas driving there. If you're not going to rent to him, he's black. You should know that. But I couldn't know. I mean, and to me, I was like, wow, this actually is not just an American thing, but it's a worldwide thing. And that to me is kind of shocking that it's still there. So I guess this is a really weird question, probably, but what do you think are the roots of this? Like, why is it that, why is racism prevalent, particularly in America? Like, why is it that somebody would be racist against a black person? Do you think media plays a role in creating that? Like, what even causes that? What are the roots of this?
I mean, the broadest, the simplest explanation is that this is the legacy of slavery and the fact that we black people in America started off on, unequal footing, being seen as chattel, and even post slavery, have not been able to kind of shed the history of that. And so part of what happens, I think is when you have a whole group of people that were basically, labor, literally slave labor, immediately there's a distinction between haves and have-nots. We are better. White people are able to say in that situation, because if you look at it, they are not necessarily, whatever your cosmology is, in the eyes of a higher power, but in the practical everyday sense of it, we're better than you. And so even though the law changed about what we say about that, there's still the stain of that from the perceptual sense, but there's also an internalized stain that happens. And so tribalism, I think, is a consequence of that, where people, you stick with who looks like you and who's comfortable with you, et cetera. And so you don't get a chance to develop a sense of empathy if you don't interact with people. it's harder, let's say. And so empathy is, I think, at the core. It's the soul of how we treat another person. If I know how my behavior affects you, I govern my behavior accordingly. But if I've practiced not thinking about your perception because I'm in this tribe and you're in that tribe, then I don't get a chance to do that. I don't get a chance to practice that level of empathy. It's much harder to oppress a person whose feelings you've taken into account. And so I think, in answer to your question, the long answer to your question is that this history of being separate, and in some cases equal, but in a lot of cases not really. The whole separate but equal thing wasn't really true. There's just been a lot of practice in not interacting with each other, and some things have, some things change that when you're forced to be together, on a job. In some ways unions help that, in terms of the bigger enemy was the guys with the money, and so collective bargaining, we were all in this together, and so in some ways that helped. In some ways, even though the military was segregated, but at some point, when people are shooting at you, we're more alike than we're different, because they're shooting at us, so there was a certain bonding that happened there. But outside of those, very incendiary conditions, we're not often forced to live with each other and interact with each other, and so that lack of empathy and internalized stains on both sides of the racial fence, I think, continue to prevail.
Yeah, it's funny because when you were saying all that, I couldn't help but think of the movie Remember the Titans. But you're talking about separate but equal, and it's interesting because in Isabel Wilkerson's book, she says like they created all these policies. I think either FDR, I don't remember which president it was. She said, but it was for home ownership, and she said what people don't actually acknowledge in history is almost all of the policies that were designed to move society forward and make life better for Americans actually excluded Black people. And I never knew that. And you look at it and you're like, wait a minute, that literally is the definition of structural racism.
Yeah. And, redlining and then those little subtle things that happen when you try to rent an apartment, even if it's, legal to do so, those things become, part of the disease of living, a racialized life, and it takes a toll, and we're in a place now where, let's just say post George Floyd, where there have been a number of incidences for decades prior to that, but I think the influence of COVID and then us being cooped up made that a different flashpoint than Mike Brown or Tamir Rice or Trayvon Martin, even though those certainly were flashpoints, but it didn't become as global as George Floyd was. But I think that was under the blanket of COVID as an additional frustration that kind of burst that bubble, and so now there's a great deal more discussion about it. There are diversity trainings and unconscious bias trainings, and white fragility as a bestseller, et cetera. But then, you're still looking at that 70 million people who voted for the other guy who's in office still. And so as a Black person in America, one still has to be, just really sanguine about it. And it's just like, oh yeah, sure. Better for sure. Better, but not great. And not as good as it should be, on the eve of 2021.
Yeah. Well, okay. So let's shift gears a little bit. What I wonder is how in the world somebody who gets a doctorate in clinical psychology ends up becoming a spoken word poet and an Emmy award-winning television producer. Those things don't seem to. Those are not two combos or three combos you'd ever imagine going together.
No, I'm happy to talk about it because I want people to to use my life as an example of you don't have to have it all figured out. And there are paths that you can make for yourself that weren't there before. And you don't have to feel stuck. You know, my favorite thing is when I hear a 25-year-old saying, "Oh, it's too late for me. I can't make it in the industry." I'm like, just shut up. You know what I mean? You're 25. The world is your oyster, and stop tripping. You know. But I like using my life as an example because it is weird. You know, it's a strange combo. You know, the unicorn of it all. But the truth is, I consider myself a writer more than I consider myself any other thing. You know, I alluded to, you know, started, you know, writing poetry when I was 8 years old, and you know, kind of fell in love with what language could do, what I could do with language, not just, you know, as a reader, but also as someone who could manipulate language and kind of break the code of what it could do. And so that's really the foundation of who I am. And it just so happens that, you know, couldn't figure out how to make a living, you know, as a poet. That was never even a thing to consider. But it is the thread that runs through my life, being able to be a storyteller with words. So while I'm, you know, a professor at a university and, you know, running a mental health center and having a private practice, I'm still writing all the time and feeling kind of frustrated that this isn't what I'm doing for a living. And at some point I thought, I'm well trained, you know, as a shrink and a professor, and that's going fine, but it's not fulfilling. It's not doing it for me. And here's where we circle back to, you know, my parents giving me the freedom to try new stuff. And so, you know, having a doctorate is a great plan B, frankly. And so it was easier to basically say, look, if this doesn't work out, moving to Hollywood and trying to be a writer, if it doesn't work out, you can come back and be a professor or open your private practice back up again. You know, no harm, no foul. And, but making the decision to leave still is the best decision I've ever made. Betting on myself, basically, to try something different, to try something that wasn't preordained by how I grew up or how I was educated. And so I moved to LA and didn't have a job, didn't know anybody in the business, knew one person, a guy, a good friend of mine from high school, but you know, he wasn't like a studio head, so that wasn't really helpful in you know, the creative hookup. And I figured it out, you know, but figured it out makes me sound like I'm smart, you know, in that way. No, I figured it out. That is, no, just stick to it. Just keep at it. And the adage of the harder you work, the luckier you get is what happened, honestly. And so I ended up, you know, tripping into reality TV at its inception because somebody took a chance on me, you know. And it flourished from there. The poetry thing continued just because I'll write all of my life, you know, regardless of whether I get paid to do it, and started to perform a little bit more and become comfortable, just, you know, doing the performance piece of it, and you know, and so now all of those things are still, you know, alive and well.
So I do want to ask you one question around the mental health piece, because I think that it seems like mental health and race have a very sort of interesting coexistence. And I know this through my own personal experience because, you know, the sort of, I don't know what it is for Black people, but I'm curious, particularly as a therapist who is Black or a psychologist who's Black. The narrative that I grew up with, particularly around, you know, mental health and getting help for it, was that therapy is for crazy people. And if you saw one, God forbid that you talk about it, so much so that there was a time, and my sister is a doctor, and for some reason she couldn't refill my prescription for my antidepressants. This is when I was taking them. And my mom, and I asked my mom, I was like, well, can you call a friend? I mean, you know, 1,000 fucking doctors, like everybody we know. And she actually refused. And I said, why? She said, because I don't want them to know that you're taking antidepressants.
Wow.
Yeah. And that, you know, so I wonder, when you look at mental health, particularly in the context of race, what have you seen?
Well, part of it is that same stigma. Part of it is that if you're getting mental health treatment, there's something broken about you in a way that's shameful, as opposed to getting dialysis, which isn't shameful, or mending a broken ankle. There's no shame in that. But having a broken brain, having broken biochemistry, that seems like it's endemic to you as a human being, and there's something corrupt about that. And so that has pervaded the community, such that it's gotten better. There are certainly people who talk about therapy and the benefits of it, and there are very prominent people who happen to be Black and are supportive. But the prevailing narrative is still, there's something wrong with you, and it's going to take a while, I think, before people realize that it is a helpful and not shameful thing to do. But that's a path. That's not going to be a quick fix, and the media psychologists who kind of traffic in those kind of quick fixes, that doesn't really help. I think the overriding narrative is still, no, there's something wrong with you and how you were raised, or how you negotiate the world, or whatever. But it's still not okay. So we still have a lot of work to do. And I think that's we just have to continue to do the work. We have to continue to tell each other, to tell our peers, to tell ourselves that we don't have this same level of shame, for a sinus infection, but when it's your brain, your feelings, your thoughts, that seems like something that you could fix on your own, to some people, and so. And with a group of people who have had reason to be wary of science, whether it be the Tuskegee experiments or Henrietta Lacks or whatever. There's it's in some ways understandable, but it's also unfortunate because there is value in this thing, beyond the fear of it.
Yeah. Well, I think that, it's funny because you're a spoken word poet, and we're spending a lot of time talking about race. And part of the reason for that is because as I was reading your poems, I realized like this plays a huge role in, your art. So I wonder, as an artist and as a creative, when you think about the choices you make, both from, the poems that you choose to compose, but also the projects you choose to get involved from a television standpoint, what is it that determines your choices? What, when you're conveying messages, like what is important to you to get across when you make things? Because like I think about my work here, and I think to me, like what I want is to give a home to people who feel like they don't have one, particularly as creatives. Like that is because I've always felt that even in my own culture, I've jokingly said, I was like, the people I feel least comfortable around are Indians, like my own, because I feel that often this is the place where I'm going to be judged. I was working on this piece about the, woes of being an immigrant in the arts. And as it is, like, it's discouraged, but then, until you become like, Mindy Kaling or Hassan Minhaj, people are like, oh, you're just some schmuck who's wasting your education.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a burden, sadly. And I think, my goal, look, I can't pretend that I've chosen every project because of some, lofty philosophy. Sometimes I need to keep the lights on, and that's just the truth of it. I'm at a point in my career now where I have more choices, and I can turn down some things that don't seem to fit, what I'm trying to accomplish in the world as a creative, and so I have a lot more freedom in what I write, of course, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But in what I try to align myself with in television work is is, a type of storytelling that allows people to have conversations about what's true in the world, even if that's not necessarily the easiest conversation to have. And so that's been fortunate. I've been able to do that for the last several years. And it's what I tell, the people who help find, gigs for me or people for me to meet with the hope of having a gig, is that this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for things that have meaning in a way beyond, just kind of following people around who are dating or in the soap opera of it. And I'm not trying to malign those things. Those are entertaining things. And
don't worry, I've unfortunately been not just, I wouldn't say a victim of it, but I've been on one of those things. So
okay,
that's my latest claim to fame now.
So you get it. And look, people are entertained by it, and in some ways, I think there are some shows that do harm, but most of them don't. I think most of them are innocuous. But it's also not necessarily a thing that I want to do. And so I make very intentional decisions around what I want to work on, and I'm willing to kind of sacrifice some stability in order to do that. But as a writer, I have a lot more control. So the book and album Boy, a collection of poems that both of which are out now. Those are culled from lots of work, but the fillet of it really is around social justice things, not just domestically, but globally, about it just how we treat each other, and how that isn't always the greatest outcome for some groups over others. So looking at the othering of what human beings can do to each other is part of the soul of the book and the album. And that was important to me, not because I have the answers, but completely opposite of that, because I don't. And I think if I'm a town crier enough about certain things, whether it be race or gender or class, let's say, then maybe somebody else is stimulated by how I've talked about it, and maybe they will have an answer, or they can be in a conversation with somebody that can have an answer. At the very least, what I'm after, to go back to something I mentioned before, what I'm after is increasing empathy. And so if I can write something in such a way, whether it be from the point of view of Khalif Browder, who was in jail for 3 years, but not really convicted of anything, or a trans woman who is reflecting on all the other trans women who have been murdered in America. If I can put those things out there, maybe somebody will think about these issues in a way that they hadn't before, and maybe they can be part of a solution that I haven't conceived of.
Wow. Well, as always, Cher has knocked it out of the park and sent us yet another amazing guest. So I want to finish with my final question, which I'm very curious to see how you're going to answer this. But what do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
I think what makes someone unmistakable is when they embrace what is unique about them. It's easy to figure out how you're part of a tribe, how you want to be part of a tribe. You want to be considered, one of the group, one of the in crowd, the cool kids in the cafeteria, whatever it happens to be. But I think what makes someone unmistakable, and being unmistakable is about someone else's perception of you largely. And so I think once you embrace what is unique about you, then it's hard for people to mistake you for someone else. And they have to acknowledge, whether they like it or not, they have to acknowledge your distinction in the world, but it's going to be harder for them to acknowledge your distinction if you don't. I acknowledge my distinction as this bizarre unicorn, doctor, poet, TV producer. It's weird, but I celebrate that. And I celebrate that not for the narcissism of it, of which there has to be some for sure, but I celebrate that for the beacon it can be for other people to embrace their unicorn, embrace their weird, embrace their unmistakable.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and sharing your insights and wisdom with our listeners. Where can people find out more about you, your work, the book, and everything else that you're up to?
Oh, thanks for asking about that. DonnyJacksonPoetry.com is a place to go, and that'll lead you to the book. Yeah, there's an album version of the book, Boy Poems, and you can find that on all the streamers, Spotify and Apple Music, iTunes, Amazon. And so I invite people to read the book or listen to the album, or do both at the same time, because that's one way of experiencing the story. So yeah, I'm not hard to find in that regard. Follow me on Instagram, not because you'll learn a lot about me particularly, but I try to feature other people regularly on my Instagram. Just Dr. Donny, doctor is spelled out, Dr. Donny on Instagram. So I hope people will check it out and let me know what they think, and share it with people that you think are like-minded that might get something from it.
Amazing. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.
This episode is brought to you by Nourish by Nature Made, the #1 pharmacist-recommended vitamin and supplement brand. Nourish is a personalized vitamin regimen customized to you. Backed by 45 years of science, they remove the guesswork from your vitamin regimen. With thousands of happy customers, Nourish is a trusted supplement brand by many. Visit Nourish.com to create your customized package today.